Who comes to mind when you hear the word genius? Isaac Newton, Albert Einstein, Charles Darwin. Scientists whose discoveries reshaped their fields beyond all recognition, whose names will never die, and whose faces will forever be plastered on the t-shirts and laptop stickers of insufferable university students for centuries. But in the world of chemistry, there remains another genius. His name isn't as well known as Funny Apple Man or German Mustache Man. No, not that German Mustache Man, put your hand down. As the title of the video may have given away, I'm talking about Linus Pauling, one of the greatest scientists of the 20th century, and the brightest chemist in the history of the United States. Of the few people that won 2 Nobel Prizes, Pauling is the only person in history whose prizes were unshared, one in chemistry, one in peace. Almost everything we now know about atoms and chemical bonding stems from Pauling. Every branch of chemistry, organic, inorganic, biochemical, analytical, and especially physical, has Pauling's fingerprints on it. Brilliant scientists are not typically known for their communication skills, but Pauling was a masterful public speaker. Throughout his time at Caltech, his lectures were the stuff of legends. A man bright enough to work on the cutting edge of science and charismatic enough to explain his research in plain English. His enthusiasm for his work was infectious. Throughout his career, he published over 850 peer-reviewed papers, 11 books, and gave countless talks on chemistry, biology, medicine, and politics. Pauling's flirtations with leftist politics made him many enemies, both in academia and the US government, but at the height of the Red Scare, he remained steadfast in his convictions. The world owes Pauling an incalculable debt, and yet not many people outside of chemistry know about him. Pauling was a genius, the likes of which physical chemistry hasn't seen since. But he was not a man without his flaws. Pauling enjoyed the spotlight. He was stubborn, impatient, argumentative, and as he grew older, he developed an unpleasant, arrogant streak. In his later years, the chemical intuition that led him to groundbreaking discoveries in the 30s and 40s led him down some baffling rabbit holes. His faith in the healing properties of vitamin C bordered on fanatical. He irresponsibly pushed remedies and cures on the public with little evidence. By the end of his career, Pauling was regarded by some as a washed-up crank, a sad old man that had burnt a legendary career to the ground, selling snake oil to the gullible and the desperate. Linus Pauling's story is not one that can be easily summed up in a single sentence. So I didn't do that. Here's a video about him instead. Linus Carl Pauling was born on the 28th of February 1901. Linus was the eldest child of Hermann and Belle Pauling. A pharmacist by training, Hermann was the son of German immigrants and worked as a travelling salesman. Linus's mother came from wealth and suffered from bouts of depression since childhood. Linus's father would be on the road for weeks at a time. When Linus was born, Belle was only 19 years old, and he was followed by Pauline in 1902 and Lucille in 1904. With little money and 3 young children to care for on her own, Belle became unhappy. To provide stability for his young family, Hermann moved his wife and children to Belle's hometown of Condon, where he would set up shop as a pharmacist. Condon was the backdrop of Pauling's happiest childhood memories. Like many great scientists, Linus showed an inclination for academics at an early age. He excelled in school and read voraciously. When he was 9 years old, Linus's father wrote a letter to a local newspaper highlighting his son's aptitude for reading and the natural sciences, asking for advice about which books to prescribe to a child with prematurely developed inclinations. But a few months after this letter was published, tragedy struck the Pauling family. In June 1910, Hermann Pauling developed a perforated stomach ulcer. Within a day, he was dead. He was 33 years old. After her husband's death, Belle Pauling fell into a deep depression from which she never emerged. She developed pernicious anemia, an autoimmune condition that prevents the body from properly absorbing vitamin B12. To keep the family afloat, she spent most of her savings to move into a large boarding house in Portland. What little was left was squandered on maids and expensive kitchen appliances. When the maids inevitably had to be let go, the house fell into disarray. It was the responsibility of her preteen children to bring in money and keep the house in order. Linus grew resentful of his mother. He and his eldest sister Pauline worked throughout their childhoods, as both housework and the family's finances fell on their shoulders. Belle had little in common with her son. She viewed school and books as a waste of time and did little to nurture her son's academic gifts. She would bark orders from her bedroom, never sparing a loving word for her children. Linus began to retreat from his family home. He would spend as much time as he could at his grandparents' house, his school, and his local library, places where he could read in peace, away from the chaos of the boarding house. In a future interview, when asked about his relationship with his mother, Pauling confessed that throughout his childhood, he could not remember having a single conversation with her about anything important. As Belle struggled to pay off her debts, Linus continued to excel academically. At age 12, he was accelerated into high school. Shortly afterwards, a friend of his would show him a bedroom chemistry set. Linus and his friend mixed sulfuric acid with granulated sugar and potassium chlorate. The ensuing eruption of purple flame and black carbon sets Pauling on a path to become one of the greatest chemists of the 20th century. Pauling needed a chemistry set of his own. His mother was too poor to buy one, so he made his own by raiding materials from an abandoned iron smelter. Pauling's love of science dominated his studies. Despite being one of the youngest children in his year, he quickly rose to the top of the class in maths and chemistry. One of his high school classmates, Paul Emmett, became a highly accomplished chemist in his own right, and the two became lifelong friends. However, Pauling's academic talents were somewhat lopsided. He was cocky, and if he didn't immediately excel on a topic, he quickly lost interest. His grades plummeted in English and Latin. At the start of the spring term of 1917, Pauling signs up for 2 semesters of American history, but when the principal refuses to give him permission to take both courses simultaneously, he decides to take further algebra and trigonometry instead, knowing full well that he needs American history for a high school diploma. Sensing his talent, Pauling's teacher even makes him a special class on university-level chemistry, which no one else in his year signs up for. By the time he was 16, Pauling had enough high school credits to enroll at Oregon State, known then as Oregon Agricultural College. He did not have a high school diploma. At OAC, Pauling got straight A's in every chemistry test he took, but performed disastrously in courses that did not immediately grab his interest. In mechanical drawing, Pauling received a D. He was too impatient to let the ink dry, so his work became covered in smudges. In gym, a course that Pauling hated, he tried to game the system. He knew that school athletic teams weren't required to take standard gym, so instead of going to class, he attempted to join the track and field team. He knocked over a hurdle, barely passed over the bar, and received the first and only F of his academic career. Due to his family's poverty, Linus had to work throughout his studies. He mopped floors, worked in campus kitchens, and even had a grueling night shift delivering milk from 8 in the evening to 4 in the morning. When he was 18, Pauling secured a summer job with the State Department as a road inspector. He sent his money to his mother to pay his tuition in the next academic year, but when Pauling was ready to start his 3rd year of college, he received a telegram from his mother. She had spent his tuition. He would have to take a year out to work if he wanted to complete his studies. This must have devastated Pauling. At only 18 years old, on the cusp of adulthood, he had made a name for himself at Oregon State as one of the brightest students in the chemistry department. At the time, very few of the instructors at Oregon State were active researchers, and most of them didn't have PhDs. The faculty did not wish to lose such a promising student. The solution was obvious. In autumn 1919, Pauling receives a telegram from his university. "Hey, do you want a job?" At age 18, Linus Pauling was teaching quantitative analysis to students his own age. It was a course he had taken only a year prior and aced. Pauling worked at OAC for the princely sum of $25 a month. Even in 1919, this was not a lot of money, especially for such technical work. But Pauling, keen to finally be paid to talk about his favourite subject, eagerly accepted. When he resumed his studies in 1920, Pauling stayed on as a teacher throughout the remainder of his time at OAC. In 1922, he met a woman that would go on to change his life. Ava Miller was a perfect fit for Linus. She was bright, ambitious, and had a bit of a rebellious streak, especially by the standards of a woman in the 1920s. On their first date, while helping Ava cross a stream, Linus accidentally smacked her in the nose with his elbow. Linus was distraught and thought he had ruined his chances with the girl of his dreams. Ava thought it was funny and agreed to a second date. To the surprise of no one, Pauling graduated top of his class. When the time came to apply to grad school, Pauling's top choice was Berkeley, in sunny California. At the time, Berkeley had one of the strongest chemistry programs in the country, for reasons we will explain later. Unfortunately, the admissions office dragged their feet in giving Pauling an offer. A better one came from a relatively new institution called Caltech. The offer was generous, your pick of supervisor and $350 a month in a teaching stipend. The choice was clear. In the spring of 1922, Linus asked Ava to marry him. She said yes, but the mothers of the young couple did not approve, and both wanted their children to finish school before marriage. Linus headed west to Caltech alone. A year later, Ava followed him to California. Linus and Ava were married on the 17th of June 1923. They would stay in the Golden State for the rest of their lives. Pauling's PhD was supervised by Roscoe Dickinson and Richard Tolman. Dickinson was a rising star in the new field of X-ray crystallography. When he was made Pauling's supervisor, Dickinson was only 28 years old and had held a PhD for only 2 years. Tolman, meanwhile, was a man at the height of his abilities, a genius who had firmly established himself as one of the most brilliant theoreticians in the United States. Tolman was one of the pioneers of physical chemistry, and his skill as a lecturer and a researcher had a profound impact on Pauling. Both Tolman and Dickinson were supervised themselves by Arthur Amos Noyes, the head of Caltech's chemistry department. Noyes had an eye for talent, and he wanted to make Caltech the best chemistry school in America. He had been the one that arranged Pauling's generous PhD offer. Before Pauling arrived at Caltech, Noyes sent him and Emmett proof sheets of a physical textbook he was working on. Within 3 months, Pauling worked through all 500 problems before he started his PhD. Pauling's work ethic in grad school was terrifying. He worked from 9 o'clock in the morning to the middle of the night, weekends included. In first year, Pauling shared a room with Paul Emmett, his old friend from high school. There was one bed in the apartment that he and Emmett took turns using. Pauling would regularly come home around 3 in the morning, whereupon Emmett would wake up and study. They did not share an apartment for another year. At Caltech, Pauling benefited from the instruction of some of the brightest scientists in the world. Robert Millikan, Pauling's chemical kinetics teacher, found out mid-class he had been awarded the 1923 Nobel Prize in physics. Pauling's optics teacher, the Austrian physicist Paul Ehrenfest, was a legend in theoretical physics, a close friend of Albert Einstein, who called him the best teacher in our profession whom I have ever known. Millikan and Ehrenfest worked on the cutting edge of science. They specialised in a strange new subject called quantum mechanics. Throughout the 1910s, the Danish theoretician Niels Bohr and the Kiwi experimentalist Ernest Rutherford developed their Moll of the atom, electrons orbiting the nucleus like planets around the sun. Physicists needed a model of the atom that explained the strange new world of quantum mechanics, but to chemists, it was hard to see how this became this. Molecules weren't random assortments of atoms, they had shapes and bond angles. Why was one shape favoured over another? Pauling was a great theoretician, but he was, first and foremost, a chemist. He saw the world in bonds and atoms, and the men who introduced them to him were 2 American chemists, Irving Langmuir and Gilbert N. Lewis. Alongside Mendeleev, Gilbert Lewis is one of the greatest chemists in history to have never been awarded a Nobel Prize, an honour that Pauling and I feel he badly deserved. I mean, the covalent bond, Lewis acid and base theory, Lewis structured paired electrons in orbitals. Gilbert Lewis was the reason Berkeley had the best chemistry department in the US. Throughout the 1910s, the two produced a series of groundbreaking papers on chemical bonding. The octet rule, the tendency for atoms to form molecules where they had 8 valence electrons, was baked into Lewis's model of the atom. He proposed that electrons formed pairs at the corner of cube-shaped atoms, atoms that would be the baseline for Lewis structures. This explained the tetrahedral shape of methane and the pyramidal shape of ammonia. Physicists like Robert Millikan were not impressed by Lewis's model. It was crude and oversimplified. Electrons weren't static, they couldn't be. Physicists knew electrons were negatively charged. They wouldn't stay at a fixed distance from a positively charged nucleus. They'd be attracted to each other, and the electron would, sooner or later, crash into the nucleus's surface. But for chemists, the model worked. As predictive tools, Lewis structures are breathtakingly powerful. To this day, they are still taught in secondary school chemistry classes. They are so simple they can be taught to 11-year-olds, and so accurate they could predict the geometry of thousands of compounds. In 1924, Pauling visited Berkeley to learn from the master, and came away starstruck. Lewis was a natural teacher, a charismatic genius chomping away at a cigar, challenging his students to debates and sharing bawdy jokes in the lab. Pauling wanted to apply for a postdoc under Lewis, but Noyes had plans for his prized student. By 1925, no one could question Pauling's genius. He blitzed through his PhD in only 3 years, publishing 5 papers. Dickinson and Tolman had taught him well. He was running the lab on his own and had supervised a dozen undergrads throughout his studies. The question was, where would he go now? A new generation of quantum physicists was coming out of Europe, and Noyes was keen for American science to keep up. On Noyes' recommendation, Pauling applied for the Guggenheim Fellowship, a prestigious award that would let him study wherever he wished in Europe. Pauling had already won a fellowship to study with Lewis at Berkeley, but Noyes sweetened the deal. Go early, go together, I'll pay. 3 months of tourism on me, see the sights. Oh, but you won't really have time to move to Berkeley. Sure you understand. Pauling saw the deal for what it was. Go to Europe and come back here, or run away to Lewis. He chose Europe. In 1926, Linus and Eva moved to Munich to study under Arnold Sommerfeld. Sommerfeld's institute attracted talent like a flame attracted moths. He turned promising students into legends. Almost every major player of quantum mechanics can be linked to Sommerfeld. 4 of his PhDs and 3 of his postdocs went on to win Nobel Prizes. Linus would be one of those postdocs. In Oregon, meanwhile, things were looking bleak. Belle Pauling's physical and mental health had sharply declined. Pauline, following her brother, moved out from home as soon as she could, leaving her youngest sister Lucille to care after her mother. Belle began to suffer from delusions and uncontrollable mood swings. With no one to turn to, Lucille had Belle committed to a mental hospital. A few weeks later, she was dead at 45 years old. Linus found out about his mother's death through the post. He could not afford to return for her funeral. Pauling's Guggenheim Fellowship was extremely productive. He wrote a series of highly regarded papers on solvation and ions, and won an extension in 1927. In April 1927, Pauling would spend a month studying under Niels Bohr in Copenhagen and Erwin Schrödinger in Zurich, 2 of the most highly respected physicists of their generation. Pauling didn't learn that much from the men themselves. Bohr was so busy throughout Pauling's stay, the men had 1 face-to-face meeting over the course of a month. And while Pauling respected Schrödinger's contributions to quantum theory, he was snobbish towards Americans and showed no interest in the applications of quantum mechanics to chemistry. He was also a closet nonce, but that's for another video. The people that made the biggest impression on Pauling were men his own age. The Dutch physicist Samuel Goudsmit, one of the co-discoverers of electron spin, was a year younger than Pauling, and the two became firm friends. Pauling helped Goudsmit translate his thesis into English, and used it as the basis for his first book, The Structure of Line Spectra. When travelling back to Germany, Pauling met Robert Oppenheimer. Unlike Pauling, Oppenheimer was an atrocious lecturer. He mumbled to his shoes, covered the floor in cigarette ash, and filled blackboard after blackboard with barely legible equations. But Pauling knew he was one of the brightest mathematical physicists in the world. The two started work on a theory of chemical bonding. Pauling would handle the chemistry, Oppenheimer would handle the maths. But to Pauling's dismay, his friendship with Oppenheimer became a tad intense. Hello, Linus. Please accept these presents. It's nothing much, just an extravagant jeweled ring and a collection of precious stones. I also wrote you 11 poems. Please ignore the homoerotic subtext. But it wasn't just Linus that old Oppie was interested in. Hello, Eva. I like your husband. Well, he's away at work. Would you like to come with me to the middle of nowhere in Mexico? Just the 2 of us? Eva told Linus, and he broke off his friendship with Oppenheimer immediately. It is unknown whether he kept the extravagant jeweled ring. Throughout his time in Europe, Pauling met all the legends of quantum mechanics' early days. Bohr, Schrödinger, Heisenberg, Dirac. But the 2 physicists that had the biggest impact on his own work are not very well known. Neither of them ever won a Nobel Prize, and other than specialists in valence bond theory, not many chemists know their names. But the German physicists Walter Heitler and Fritz London would change the trajectory of Pauling's life forever. In 1927, Heitler and London published a landmark paper, the quantum mechanical treatment of the hydrogen molecule. When 2 hydrogen atoms were at a certain distance from each other, the negatively charged electrons would be attracted to the positively charged nuclei. Following the work of Heisenberg, Heitler and London predicted at a certain distance the electrons would rapidly interchange their positions. The wave function that resulted from the averaging out of the two states showed electron density would concentrate in a sweet spot between the nuclei. The idea was called resonance. Heitler and London were physicists, and only applied their work to H2, but Pauling knew they had discovered something enormous. Something deeper, much more fundamental than just one molecule. In 1927, he returned to Caltech to start a new career as a professor in theoretical chemistry. He knew that resonance was an idea worth looking into. It was one that would go on to win him a Nobel Prize.
Please be seated, members of the League of Nasty Schemes. We gather here today to discuss the target of our latest evil plot. We of course refer to Brilliant!
You need to press F5. It's not full screen.
I don't care if it's full screen, cornbrain, don't get involved. For years, Brilliant has provided the public with thousands of lessons on maths, data science, and artificial intelligence. With the help of these nerds, Brilliant has crafted a slew of devious puzzles that help train the brain through hands-on problem solving.
But boss, what does Brilliant have to do with us?
I'm glad you asked, Mantis Face.
My name is Andrew.
Instead of rote memorization, Brilliant builds critical thinking skills through problem solving. Their courses on data analysis and programming draw from real-world examples. Users of any skill level can learn how to apply mathematical reasoning skills to real-world situations. Every day you use it, you'll get smarter and smarter. By conquering Brilliant, the world will be too stupid to stop us. Mwahahahaha.
Koji, the mascot of Brilliant.org.
You made a foolish mistake coming here, Koji. You're hopelessly outnumbered.
I see now. By going to brilliant.org/mqtate or scanning the QR code on screen, we could have got 30 days completely free.
We could have even got 20% off an annual premium subscription while supporting independent animation on YouTube.
So, we good? Fair enough. In the eyes of his students, Pauling was a walking god. He was a natural lecturer, confident, charismatic, and fiercely intelligent. Pauling's biographer, Thomas Hager, painted the following picture of his teaching style. He would stride into a classroom, his long wavy hair flying, eyes sparkling, and launch into a seemingly disconnected series of observations, punctuated by lightning mental calculations, jokes about colleagues, and things he had read in the paper that morning. He would wave his arms in the imitation of a hydrogen atom, perform stunts with chemicals, draw cartoons of cannons firing photons at electrons. Sometimes he would lie down on a table, Roman style, his students called it, talking with his head supported on one hand, and somehow, through it all, he would weave a coherent, eye-opening lecture. Amongst the faculty, however, Pauling's reputation was more mixed. Tolman, Pauling's old mentor, was becoming increasingly annoyed by his former student. Linus was undoubtedly a genius, but he was pushy and a bit of a prima donna, someone that had gotten a bit too comfortable being the smartest man in the room. Pauling's early career as a professor was spent in crystallography. From 1927 to 1930, he churned out a series of foundational papers on the characterization of minerals, but Heitler and London's work never left his mind. In March 1928, Pauling showed that the Heitler-London bond was equivalent to the paired covalent bond postulated by Lewis in the 1910s, and that it could explain the stability of triple-bonded molecules like N2. He then dropped a bombshell. It has further been found that as a result of the resonance phenomenon, a tetrahedral arrangement of the four bonds in the quadrivalent carbon atom is the stable one. The detailed accounts of this material in this note will be submitted for publication in JACS. If Pauling had found a quantum mechanical explanation for tetrahedral carbon, it would be a career-defining achievement. No model other than Lewis's explained four-bonded carbon. There was just one problem. He hadn't found it. Pauling's proof didn't exist. Look, here's the thing about quantum mechanics, okay? Pauling's maths was good, especially for a chemist. But there's good, and then there's 1930s quantum physicist good. By Pauling's own admission, he was no Oppenheimer or Dirac. For any element other than hydrogen, the equations were analytically impossible to solve. Even if you heavily approximated them, getting an answer, let alone one that agreed with experiment, was nightmarishly difficult. The maths was too complicated. Pauling took a gamble. He knew resonance theory was powerful enough to prove this, and that someone else would get there before him. He just needed a little more time. The month went, then the rest of the year, then another year. By the end of 1930, Pauling had all but given up, and returned to crystallography. And then, one evening in December 1930, he cracked it. 6 months before Pauling's breakthrough, the American physicist John C. Slater released a paper called Atomic Shielding Constants. Electronic wave functions have these things called nodes, distances from the centre of the nucleus where the probability of finding an electron is 0. If you plot this function on a graph, nodes are the bits where the function crossed the x-axis, flipping the sign of the function. Finding a function that included these nodes, especially in the days before computers, was a nightmare. But Slater showed that for molecules, especially those with large atoms, nodes didn't matter very much. They were very near the nucleus and could be neglected without introducing too much error. His simplified formula, now known as the Slater-type orbital, gave excellent predictions for bond lengths with slightly simpler maths. This is the breakthrough Pauling needed. After playing around with Slater's formulae, combining a wave function here, approximating a bit there, he had done it. A quantum mechanical explanation, a tetrahedral carbon. With the numbers alone, he had constructed a diamond. Pauling stayed up all night, feverishly writing out calculations. After 2 months of frantic work, he sent his paper off to JAX. It was the first of a series of 7 papers that would define his career, the nature of the chemical bond. The key to Pauling's success was hybridization. In carbon, the valence electrons have 4 orbitals to choose from, 1 2s orbital and 3 2p orbitals. The 2p orbitals are the same, just rotated around different axes, 2px, 2py, 2pz. Pauling showed that by mixing or hybridizing these orbitals, you could make something that would later be called an sp3 orbital, 1 part s, 3 parts p. If each electron occupied an sp3 orbital, they would spread out to minimize the repulsion of the negative charges. The optimal shape to avoid this repulsion was a tetrahedron, just as experiment showed. When bonds were forming, hybrid orbitals of neighbouring atoms would arrange themselves in a way that maximised the overlap between the two. The better the overlap, the stronger the bond. It turned out that Slater independently wrote a proof for tetrahedral carbon shortly before Pauling. His paper was published only 2 weeks after Pauling sent his off to the editors. Fortunately, Slater liked Pauling and stayed in touch with him throughout the 1930s. Slater's work was more mathematically thorough, but Pauling's method was more general and allowed for the calculation of bond strengths. He also went deeper with resonance in subsequent papers. Much, much deeper. Take benzene, a 6-membered ring with bond angles of 120 degrees. Pauling showed that benzene was a resonance hybrid, an average of 5 different structures that you could draw in the same way that Lewis had predicted. His calculations fit experiment beautifully. From the 1930s, 2 competing theories of the chemical bond emerged. The work of Heitler, London, Slater and Pauling formed the basis of valence bond theory. On the other side of the coin was molecular orbital theory, championed, among others, by Robert Mulliken and Erich Huckel. Instead of hybridized orbitals, MO theory posited that each molecule had a unique set of molecular orbitals, generated as a weighted sum of the orbitals of each atom. If this sounds mathematically dense, it is. MO theory was a tough sell to chemists. The maths was far more complicated than VB theory, and cumbersome to do by hand. This wasn't helped by the communication skills of the theory's adherents. Huckel was similar to Schrödinger, a physicist with no interest in organic chemistry. Mulliken, meanwhile, was like Oppenheimer, a brilliant theorist but an atrocious public speaker. He was chronically shy and whispered over the tops of his listeners' heads. When he was awarded the Nobel Prize in 1966, he was surprised when a friend advised him to carefully prepare his Nobel lecture. In 30 years of teaching, he had never prepared a lecture in advance. Though they were intimidated by the maths, more and more chemists realised the power of VB theory. It would define the way we thought about molecules for a generation. Throughout the 30s, Pauling was unmatched in both the lab and the lecture theatre. At only 30 years old, he was made a full professor. In 1932, he wrote the first ever paper on electronegativity, the power of an element to bring electrons closer to itself in a bond. Pauling described this so well that the way chemists think about electronegativity hasn't really changed in 90 years. He nailed it on the first try. The life of a 1930s housewife was never going to be enough for Eva Pauling. She respected her husband's work schedule and kept a happy home, but Eva had a bright mind and she was eager to take on the world. She became a political activist and a staunch defender of Franklin Delano Roosevelt's New Deal. For the first 30 years of his life, Pauling's political views had largely mimicked those of his parents, staunch Teddy Roosevelt Republicans. But the toll the Great Depression took on the country was hard to ignore. The political winds in California were changing. FDR was the first Democrat to win the Golden State since 1852. When Linus talked politics with Eva, he found her arguments more convincing than his own. In the 30s, he switched parties and remained an on and off supporter of the Democrats for 30 years. During the Great Depression, the staff at Caltech were asked by Millikan to take a 10% pay cut. To keep the school afloat, Caltech looked for private donations. One such donation came from the Rockefeller Foundation, $500,000 for research in biology and psychology. In the 1930s, the Rockefeller Foundation were big supporters of eugenics. Adjusting for inflation, they spent at least $7 million on eugenicist experimentation in Germany in the 1920s, and continued to fund this research after the Nazis took power in 1933. Thankfully, Pauling's talents were put to more benevolent purposes. His work on pure theoretical chemistry wasn't of much interest to the Rockefellers, but what did interest them was his work on crystallography. Pauling was put to work on the study of proteins. Pauling had never taken a biology course in his life, but he knew his chemistry. He became interested in the study of hemoglobin, a protein in red blood cells responsible for transporting oxygen throughout the body. In the 30s, no one really knew what proteins looked like. All they knew for sure was they were big and a nightmare to extract in large quantities. The molecular structure of hemoglobin wouldn't be determined for another 25 years, but for a man with no training in biology, Pauling made profound contributions to the puzzle. With the Rockefellers' money, he published 3 landmark papers. One explaining how oxygen in the bloodstream binds to iron in hemoglobin, one on denaturation, the process of protein structures being destroyed through heat or chemical change, and just for funsies, a paper that predicted the energetics of hydrogen bonding in ice 30 years before it could be validated with a computer. Pauling was at the top of his game. In the words of Warren Weaver, the head of Rockefeller's grant committee, were all the rest of Caltech's chemistry department wiped away except for Pauling, it would still be one of the most important departments of chemistry in the world. He was overdue for a promotion. In 1935, A.A. Noyes was diagnosed with colon cancer. When Pauling was made a full professor, Noyes was confident he would someday succeed him as head of department. But in the years leading up to his death, Noyes' faith in his pet genius began to waver. Pauling's lack of talent for office politics was becoming painfully clear. Bureaucracy bored him, and he had no reservations about pestering management for money. His pet projects took priority over the collective needs of the department, and he aggressively competed with colleagues for grants and postdoc positions. To many, Tolman seemed the better choice. Tolman himself wasn't interested in the role, but he was older, wiser, and most importantly, less likely to make an ass of himself in front of the school's donors. Noyes confided his illness in Millikan, one of his closest friends in Caltech, and went on sabbatical. Word began to spread throughout the department that Noyes was at death's door. Bold as brass, Pauling went to Millikan's office to discuss who he had in mind to succeed Noyes as head of school. Millikan was furious. He told Pauling he was far too young to lead the department and booted him out. Noyes knew if Pauling didn't get what he wanted, he would look for the door. After much consultation with Millikan and Tolman, a compromise was struck. We grant you the rank of head of department, but we're going to make a new council to sound off on all decisions and basically strip you of any power to actually change things. Pauling sulked and sent off a letter to Harvard letting them know he was interested in a teaching position. When this failed to come to pass, Pauling continued to pester Noyes for more money and more responsibilities. When Noyes died in 1936, Pauling's name was mud. Millikan and Tolman were disgusted with him. Pauling badgered the man that made his career right up to the point that he was dying of cancer. The pallbearers of Noyes' coffin included every member of the Caltech Executive Council, except Pauling. The council then offered the position to Tolman, who turned it down. They then offered it to Pauling. Humiliated and angry, Pauling declined the position. For several months, Caltech just didn't have a head, but eventually, cooler heads prevailed. Pauling might have been pushy, but he was the best theoretical chemist in America, and the council knew it. In 1937, they offered him a new contract with a raised salary of $9,000. Pauling accepted. Despite the council's fears, Pauling was a highly capable head of department. He was happy to delegate to those with more patience for bureaucracy. His ties to the Rockefeller Foundation were a great advert for university fundraising. In 1939, he fashioned his papers on the chemical bond into a textbook that would be a staple of university libraries for a generation of undergraduates. Among young chemists, Pauling was a legend. As Lewis had done for Berkeley, Caltech's chemistry department was becoming a magnet for the ambitious and the great, those that wanted to work with the legendary Linus Pauling. It was around this time that Linus garnered a nickname, the Wizard of Pasadena. Fascism revolted Pauling. After the Nazis took power, many scientists, especially Jews like Einstein, Hitler, and London, fled the Reich. Others, like Heisenberg, actively collaborated with the Nazi regime. When Hitler invaded Poland in 1939, Pauling was a firm supporter of American intervention in World War II. With Ava's encouragement, he started giving left-wing political speeches on campus on the need to stand up to fascism. This ruffled some feathers. Scientists were meant to be apolitical. Chemists were meant to talk about bond lengths and lattice enthalpies, not the perils of totalitarianism. Pauling viewed this neutrality as cowardice. 2 years later, Pauling was vindicated. After America entered the war in response to Pearl Harbor, he had taken a political stance and had been proven right. In 1941, Pauling fell ill. Within a month, he gained nearly 20 pounds and could not fit his feet into his shoes. When giving a speech at an award ceremony, his face was so puffy he could barely open his eyes. Pauling was diagnosed with Bright's disease, a condition now known as acute glomerulonephritis. The disease is characterized by damage to the glomeruli, small waste filters inside the kidneys. When doctors detected higher levels of protein inside Pauling's urine, the prognosis was bleak. Each kidney has over 1 million glomeruli, but in Pauling's case, enough of them have been damaged to the point his kidneys were no longer properly filtering waste. If the condition was left untreated, it would lead to total shutdown of the kidneys. Pauling sought the help of the Scottish physician Thomas Addis. In both medicine and politics, Addis was a maverick. He was a proud Marxist and a supporter of the Republican faction in the Spanish Civil War, positions that would eventually cost him his career. Addis prescribed a low-protein, salt-free diet, controversial at the time as protein was generally thought to help repair kidneys. With his wife's help, Pauling followed the Addis diet religiously for 15 years and saw a total recovery. Addis's faith in the role of diet and supplemental vitamins in human health deeply affected Pauling. Remember this for later. In 1943, Robert Oppenheimer paid Pauling a visit. "Hello, Linus. Sorry we haven't seen eye to eye recently. Would you, Ava, and your 4 children like to move to the middle of nowhere in New Mexico? You will work on a weapon that will claim hundreds of thousands of lives. I promise I won't try and sleep with your wife again." Pauling declined. Throughout the early 1940s, most research at Caltech was directed towards the war. Pauling was put to work making rocket propellants and oxygen meters for submarines, but he still found time to work on proteins. Some of his work, unfortunately, was more successful than others. In 1942, Pauling made a rare scientific blunder. He enlisted the help of the assistant professor Dan Campbell to work on antibodies, proteins produced by the immune system to fight off viruses and harmful bacteria. In March 1942, Pauling gave a press release. Campbell had created the world's first artificial antibody from bovine gamma globulin, a protein in cow's blood. Pauling and Campbell published their findings in the Journal of Experimental Medicine. Immunologists tore it to shreds. Pauling and Campbell's paper was suspiciously light on detail, and many found it hard to replicate their experiments. Those that did got negative results. What Campbell thought was an antibody was most likely a cluster of random proteins dragged down by the sheer volume of globulin he added to the solution. The work wasn't a complete waste. Pauling had been largely correct about how antibodies bound to their targets, but it would take another 40 years for artificial antibodies to be made in the lab. Pauling never retracted his paper, and until the day he died, he insisted Campbell had made artificial antibodies. The more successful he became, the more faith he placed in his scientific intuition, faith that would go on to blind him. As Linus slaved away in the lab, Ava did her part to help in the war effort. As well as looking after the kids, she underwent training as an air raid warden and became politically involved with the American Civil Liberties Union to protest against the internment of Japanese Americans. After Pearl Harbor, anti-Japanese sentiment in America was rampant. Dr. Zeus, of all people, was one of the biggest supporters of Japanese internment camps. In 1945, Pauling hired a Japanese-American gardener from a camp and launched a personal letter-writing campaign on behalf of Japanese-American grad students at Caltech. In March of that year, vandals defaced the Pauling family's garage with racist graffiti. He received threatening phone calls at work, and when Ava complained to the police, she was told, well, that's what you get for hiring a Japanese worker. On the 7th of August 1945, Linus Pauling walked into a drugstore and bought his morning paper. It is a front page he will remember for the rest of his life. Hiroshima had been wiped off the map. 3 days later, Nagasaki is obliterated. On the 15th of August, Japan surrenders. The war is over. Pauling is grimly fascinated by the atomic bomb. He begins giving popular lectures on the science behind nuclear weapons. Talks on how we can build a better world, free of war and suffering. Talks that bring unwanted attention. Hello, this is MQ Tate, or just Max if you're feeling cash. I'm recording this on Saturday the 21st of December 2021, which will hopefully be the upload date, but I've probably just jinxed myself and will notice a really big error 2 minutes before I upload the video. This is by far the biggest video I've ever worked on, so big I had to split it into 2 parts just to get it finished on time. Bit of a grander scope than my usual stuff. Hopefully the algorithm showed some love. It was a lot of work, but I am pretty happy with the final product. Hopefully you guys like it as well. Second half will drop in January. Please consider subscribing if you want to stay updated. Thank you to my Patreons for making the edit much less stressful than it could have been. For those of you new to the channel, I'm in the last stretch of my PhD, and I also tutor part-time, so being able to go to labs and work on my videos without stressing about where my weekly shop was coming from was a big weight off my mind. If you want to check out my Patreon and get a cool little picture like this, or even a moving picture like this, ooh, I deliberately keep the prices low because I know a good chunk of my audience are suffering from cosy lives. I also write little behind-the-scenes pieces for each of my videos for Patreons that are curious about how the sausage is made. So those of you that want to chuck me a few coppers, that would be deeply appreciated, thank you. All the papers and books and music I used in this video are in the description. Don't mean to brag, but I have prepared an annotated reference section. I know a few academics in the audience who just went a bit weak at the knees. Thanks again to Brilliant, they were very nice to work with. Thank you to the artists and historians and scientists whose work I shamelessly pilfered. Please support them in whatever ways you can. Right, it's 4 days to Christmas, so I'm going to edit this in, upload the video, and then go touch grass. And all again, let's blame Vinor. Merry Christmas, Happy New Year. See you all in a couple of weeks. Bye!